On this week's 51%, we kick off Women's History Month. We learn how the first female flight attendants in the U.S. fought for equal labor protections and contributed to the larger feminist movement in the process.
I used to joke and say that it was good training for being in the feminist movement and in Washington, D.C., because part of what I did was pick up people's garbage and thank them for it.
We also speak with author and biographer Shelley Fraser Mickle about the fascinating life of Teddy Roosevelt's White House wild child. I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessie King. It's Women's History Month. Each episode this month, we're going to dive into the story of a notable woman throughout history. Today, we've got a lineup of stories about women who pushed back against societal expectations to be their authentic selves. First up, a new film from PBS's American Experience delves into the lives of some of the first flight attendants in the U.S. and how their own calls for equal working conditions contributed to the larger feminist movement. Back in the 1950s and 60s, stewardesses, as they were known, were exclusively women and women of a certain look and age. Airlines wanted white, young, thin, conventionally beautiful women to cater to their male passengers. It was in some ways a glamorous gig that gave women the opportunity to see the world, but they also faced strict restrictions. Stewardesses couldn't be married, couldn't really say no to their passengers, and couldn't keep their jobs past the age of 32. But as you might imagine, the women daring enough to fly back then were also daring enough to speak out. Patricia Ireland was one of them. Before she became a prominent feminist and president of the National Organization for Women in the 1990s, Ireland was a stewardess with Pan American Airways, or Pan Am. In Fly With Me, directors Helen Dabrowski and Sarah Colt share the story of Ireland and her colleagues as they take to the skies and ultimately take up picket signs. I caught up with both Ireland and Dabrowski for a preview.
Part of what I liked about doing Fly With Me was that it required me to go back and remember all these things, including growing up and what it meant to me to find the job with Pan Am. I grew up in the Chicago area. My family on both sides were from there. And then we moved around Lake Michigan to Valparaiso, Indiana. I did really enjoy, after undergraduate school, figuring out what I was going to do. I had waited tables, it feels like, all my life. It occurred to me I could try to be a stewardess, and went to a bunch of interviews in Chicago, some of which were more offensive than the others. And lo and behold, I got hired for Pan Am, which was in some ways, sheer luck. But because I spoke Spanish and German, Pan Am seemed like a logical fit. We only flew internationally. And for a young woman from Indiana, it was a particularly eye-opening experience. I loved the feel of flying. I liked being on the runway and having them rev up the engines and then let go of the throttle and you go zooming up in the air. It just thrilled me. And to be able to work in that environment, I thought was going to be ideal. As it turned out, it was pretty darn good, but it was also a lot of hard work.
I was going to ask, what exactly were airlines looking for in a stewardess? What did that job end up looking like?
For one thing, the atmosphere and the service was entirely different than it is these days. We served a hot meal with a cocktail service in advance, then a hot meal on every flight that was over an hour and 15 minutes. I was running up and down the aisles, delivering trays and then picking trays up. And I used to joke and say that it was good training for being in the feminist movement and in Washington, D.C., because part of what I did was pick up people's garbage and thank them for it. So, I decided at some point I wasn't going to take their garbage anymore. And that's when I moved on.
On that note, before we move forward here, maybe we should talk a little bit about what it was like to be a woman at that time, even in the U.S. You both kind of make it clear in the film that this wasn't really a time where women often traveled alone.
Well, the respectable women didn't travel alone, let's put it that way. Helen, why don't you jump in here? Because I know you did a lot of research and understand what it was like back then.
Well, and I think, Patricia, you also do in the film, as you'll see, I don't think you've seen it yet, is we do unpack the expectations for middle class, and I would say predominantly middle class white women in the 1950s. The sort of dominant expectation is you're going to go to school, maybe you'll go to college, then you'll work for a couple of years, and then you will come home, get married, and have children. And the jobs that women of that class were working were typically very gendered jobs, teachers, nurses. This job was something that offered women an opportunity to see the world, or maybe not even see the world, but see more of the United States than they would have in any other female job occupation that you could kind of get those days. While airlines are hiring women who are very much fitting this dominant cultural feminine ideal, they're also hiring women who are curious and capable, and they need to be capable. And they're training them in a lot of different areas: safety, the ability to keep a cool head in an emergency and evacuate a plane, and have all these people management skills. For those who are starting to chafe against the rules and requirements, or the rule that, you have to force retirement at a certain age, or fitting a certain bodily standard, the women who start to chafe against those really start to push back, and they're capable and intelligent, and they do that in a number of different ways, as we explore in the film.
And part of what was going on in the external world also spilled over into what we were experiencing with the airlines. At that time, women could not get credit. We didn't have any laws that required equal pay. Abortion was illegal. Birth control was barely available, even for married couples. You couldn't even really go out to dinner in a restaurant by yourself. It was taboo. You were clearly a loose woman. All of those restrictions ended up carrying over to the airlines, whereas Helen said you had to retire at age 32, or if you got married, the health insurance, medical insurance covered the wives of husbands, but not the husbands of wives, the husbands of flight attendants, because after all, we weren't supposed to have husbands. There was a weight check. They put you on suspension if you were over a certain weight. We had to wear red lipstick and girdles and high heels. I mean, they interested themselves in almost every aspect of our being.
How quickly did I guess this chafe for you, Patricia?
Fairly quickly, although I was one of those women who was late coming to feminism in a way. For one thing, there was in Central and South America, there were a lot of the so-called dirty wars. There was a lot of horrible disappearances and just incredibly oppressive regimes. And I would have one of those generals in the first class and realize I was supposed to be nice to this person, or I'd be in economy and feel somebody's hand on the back of my leg and realize I was supposed to smile and take it. So that started grating on me sooner rather than later. But then I was there when they changed the rules allowing us to get married. And it was really when my husband needed dental surgery and the airline told me, oh no, if you were a man, we'd cover your wife and family. But because you're a woman, we don't cover your husband. That kind of thing was more immediately distressing because it affected the well-being of my family.
Mm-hmm. You were studying to be a lawyer at this time too, right? You were in law school?
The first 4 years I was not. And then my fifth year, I started law school because I had experienced what was directly illegal job discrimination with the health insurance. I really realized that I had to have more understanding of our rights. The other thing that happened is when the other married flight attendants found out about this change, one of them in the crew room threw her arms around my neck and said, "Oh, wow, we really won." And that "we" stuck with me.
I was going to say, when we start looking in sort of the efforts to fight for reform here, what do you feel maybe played the biggest role in your victory on this?
Part of it was affirmative action. President Johnson had just signed an executive order requiring federal contractors to have equal employment laws and non-discrimination laws. So part of it was that the law had already changed a little bit, and it just took someone like me who was bold enough, I guess, to actually take it on and challenge it. So for me, the changes started outside of me and then became part of my very being.
It's not that these women were necessarily waking up in the morning and deciding that they wanted to be activists. It was typically a response to seeing an injustice in the way they were being treated on the job, or even trying to get the job and taking any path they could to get there. And the women were doing it in all different ways, some through their unions. I would say that some flight attendants absolutely tried that route and it weren't getting anywhere with it. One flight attendant whose story we follow, she holds a big press conference about how they're getting fired at age 32, and she gets stewardesses together. And can you tell, actually, when you look at all of us, who's over or under 32, and why does that even matter? They'll take it to the press. There's another flight attendant who did the same thing. She brought her story about being fired when she was secretly married to the press. In addition to that, she tried to go through her union, go through the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which was in charge of enforcing the Civil Rights Act that said that you cannot have discrimination on the basis of gender. There were women who filed lawsuits. I would say that these individuals are sort of taking any way, any method, any path they can in order to get their job, keep their job, or make it more equitable.
One part of the documentary that I thought was really interesting was just like, how you had to even fight to get the Equal Opportunity Commission to do its job and to take, women's complaints seriously. And I can't remember who said it in the documentary, so I'm sorry, but there was someone who mentioned that, like if there's a law that people don't want to enforce, they might just not do it.
That's Patricia.
You had a good quote.
Well, the other thing that was interesting to me, because now we've come up to the point where the National Organization for Women had been formed in 1966, and a woman named Sonia Fuentes, who was one of the founders, was the first woman lawyer in the General Counsel's office at the EEOC. And she was horrified by what she found, that is the unwillingness to enforce the law on behalf of women. And so she and a couple of her friends, including a man named Phineas Idris, I loved his name, and Mary Eastwood. And after work, she would go over there to Mary's apartment and they would talk about what was going on and they would strategize about how to change it. And the next month, the EEOC would find itself with a whole lot of women picketing their offices for failure to enforce the law on behalf of women. And they could never quite figure out how now knew about this stuff. Sonia said she had a lot of mixed emotions about it because she's a very honest and a woman of great integrity. But she decided that the principle of equality overrode her employer's desire for her to keep things confidential. That law being passed and the EEOC, many of them for good reason, because the law in their view was aimed at racial discrimination and prejudice. And because there wasn't sufficient funding, and today there's even less funding, there was a resource allocation issue. And that to me was why we ended up with this trio. That is a woman who was willing to step forward and take the risk, a law that said she was entitled to what she was seeking, and an outside organization to push hard on public opinion. And that, I think, is the combination. Plus, we had some good people elected to office, but I always thought they were kind of a last step. We had to change their constituencies' minds first.
How do you feel this either folded into or contributed to the overall women's movement?
Yeah, it was definitely part of what was going on throughout the country and throughout the various places that women were. I think that part of what happened is that the flight attendants, because the rules and regulations were so tied to the gender expectations of women, probably saw and rankled against these restrictions very early. But also, I think that there was a certain prejudice within the feminist movement against women who used their looks to get ahead. And that was certainly part of getting to be a stewardess, as we were then known. You had to look the way that the men in the company wanted you to look, just generally act the way a traditional woman was supposed to, which is, by the way, how the Southwest Airlines union, the Transport Workers Union, got in there, because Southwest Air tried to put their flight attendants in orange shorts, little tiny shorts. And the women went to the company's head and said, "We're not going to wear these little shorts." And he said, "Well, what you women need," I think what he said was, "what you girls need is a union," never thinking they would do that. But, the process of the feminist movement and the women who were stewardesses getting together was not always without its friction.
When you look back on that time, is there a particular moment that you find yourself going back to a lot or that particularly sticks in your mind?
Gosh, that's a good question. And I found that my coworkers, my colleagues, were just the best group of people. And it's why when I was practicing law in recent years, after I came back from now, I went in to represent unions and their members, because I found flight attendants to be among the funniest, best people. They were smart, they were experienced in the world, they were well read. They just were a wonderful group of women, and then men, because that was also a problem, is getting men into the flight attendant job in later years. But I miss my friends. I liked everything about my colleagues. They were great.
Patricia Ireland is the former director of the National Organization for Women and one of the many former flight attendants featured in the new American Experience film Fly With Me on PBS. The film is directed by Helen Dabrowski and Sarah Colt. To check your PBS schedule for when it might be airing near you, you can go to pbs.org. From the skies to the White House. President Theodore Roosevelt once said of his eldest daughter, Alice, quote, "I can do one of two things. I can be president of the United States, or I can control Alice. I cannot possibly do both," end quote. Shelley Fraser Mickle is an award-winning author and one-time commentator for WUFT in North Central Florida with more than a dozen books under her belt. She is mostly known for her narrative fiction writing, but in recent years she has branched out to biographies and narrative history. Her latest book is called White House Wild Child: How Alice Roosevelt Broke All the Rules and Won the Heart of America. It gives a compelling look at the strong-willed Alice, the woman who raised her, and America's obsession with her. Mickle says Alice was a major celebrity at the turn of the 20th century, for her looks partially, but also for the salacious gossip she produced and her influence on national politics. Mickle says the idea for the book actually came while researching for her 2020 biography, Borrowing Life, which told the story of the medical team that performed the first successful organ transplant. Mickle says she came across a number of historical figures who died of kidney disease in her research, including Alice Roosevelt's mother, also named Alice, who died of kidney failure when baby Alice was just 2 days old.
And get this, on the same day, his mother died. So Teddy Roosevelt was absolutely devastated. That's when he went to the Badlands, became a cowboy, and worked hard and physically to try to overcome that great grief. And over time, little Alice interpreted that silence as disapproval. So she spent her whole life not only trying to get his attention, but also trying to get back at him for not loving her in the way she needed.
You liken America's obsession with Alice Roosevelt at around the turn of the 20th century to that of someone, like Princess Diana or Taylor Swift. So what was so compelling about Alice?
Alice lived in a time when newspapers did not even mention the names of women except when they announced their wedding and after they were already dead. And yet Alice, let me paint this for you. When she arrived in Washington, her father ascended to the presidency when she was only 17 due to the assassination of William McKinley. So it was quick and overnight. And no one really knew about Alice, and they only knew that Teddy Roosevelt had 6 children. Alice was the oldest. So she arrives on the train in Washington, D.C. with her father to move into the White House. And when she got off the train and stood on the train platform, she was wearing a wine dress with a bouquet of violets in her waistband. The flashbulbs went off. And she became very quickly the most photographed woman in the world. People could not get enough of her. And when she walked out on the street, young women would circle her and applaud and celebrated who she was. She was really a role model for pushing the boundaries.
You mentioned earlier that you believe Alice enjoyed stirring up trouble for her father. What were her so-called antics that she was known for?
Yeah, and people couldn't get enough of these because she was very creative. Okay, first of all, in her purse, she started carrying a copy of the Constitution, a dagger. Sometimes she used a little pistol, and sometimes a fertility image, and also a little snake, green snake named Emily Spinach. And when her father would have the congressman come to the White House for parties, Alice would take little Emily Spinach, the snake, out of her purse and wear her as jewelry. And she got a great kick out of watching the congressman's eyes focused on Emily Spinach as she explored the folds in her dress. Alice was, as we say in the South, a mess, bless her heart. And people couldn't get enough of her. When she smoked in the White House, her father said, "You can't smoke under my roof." So she climbed to the roof of the White House and smoked there. And since Alice was pathologically shy and never spoke in public, she sent messages to the press of where she was and what she was doing. And they rushed there, and she had an ongoing competition with her father as to who could create more newspaper print. I think that he admired her toughness, her fierceness, because she was actually very much like he was. It's just that he was president and she was a woman. She lived to 96, and those antics of her early womanhood were transferred later in life into being like the first Twitter feed. She had outrageous things to say about everybody in the culture, and especially in the political arena. For instance, she said about Calvin Coolidge that he looked like he had been weaned on a pickle, and about Thomas Dewey that he looked like the little man on the top of the wedding cake. And he never overcame that. It really ruined his political career. So Alice kept transferring her power into, she ran the most famous salon in Washington, D.C. And here's another part. I'm going to work up to why I really am smitten with this book. She married the Speaker of the House. The whole country thought, well, she needs someone to tame her, and everybody got caught up in who was going to be her husband. So she married Nick Longworth. You know, in Washington today, there's a Longworth building, but Nick Longworth played around on Alice after they were married, and she played around on him. And eventually, she created a love affair with a famous senator, Bill Burr from Idaho. They called him the Lion of the Senate. He was very handsome and a great orator with a beautiful voice. And they had a child together. It was not known during Alice's time, but it's known today. And that child, Nick, was a great philanderer and an alcoholic, and Alice got back at him, and she would stick a pin in him by saying with the birth of the child, she was going to name the child Deborah and spell it Deborah after her lover. Alice could not restrain her fierceness. She always got back at people. She always put in her 2 cents worth. So that child, when she grew up, Alice was a terrible mother, and she just didn't realize it because she had no empathy. She had no compassion. She was self-absorbed. So this child grew up, and when she was in her late 20s, she was married and had a baby, a child who was 10 when her mother died of a drug overdose. And Alice had this transformative change at the age of 73. I always call it enormous changes at the last minute. And this is what drew me to really wanting to write this story. Otherwise, it would be very flat and meaningless. But Alice changed completely when she was 73. She took her granddaughter and raised her lovingly with all the unconditional love and support that she herself had never felt she had in her childhood. I say in the book that Alice lived a haunted childhood, and she did, and she made up for it in the last years of her life. In fact, I kind of want to make this point. When I finished the manuscript, I wanted to get some powerful endorsements because I'm not known as a narrative historian. And my writing Borrowing Life qualified me to become a member of Biographers International. So on that emailing list of members of that, I picked out Jonathan Alter, who's the biographer of Jimmy Carter and very well known in our culture and politics. I sent him an email and I told him I had this book about Alice, and he wrote back immediately and said, I've always been fascinated with Alice. I had tea with her granddaughter like 10 years ago because I just am so interested in Alice and her place in our culture. So then he told me, he said, you know, there's a play in New York about Alice and her cousin Eleanor Roosevelt, Hissing Cousins, or I don't know if that was the title, but they're kind of known of that as that title. So he said, I went to see it, and the playwright told me that she'd never been able to get in touch with Alice's granddaughter for an interview. And I myself had tried that, and Alice's granddaughter never answered the phone. So Jonathan Alter told me that the playwright said that word got back to her that Alice's granddaughter never wanted Alice to be seen by her mean antics. She loved her, and Alice was good to her and raised her lovingly, and she wanted the story of Alice to be more than just of her antics and outrageousness. And so what I'm most proud of is I think that I've done that.
You know, it sounds like Alice Roosevelt was full of surprises. But, lastly, was there anything that particularly struck you while researching for this book?
Well, I think that at the end of her life, what I like to find was that she said she would have aimed for the Oval Office rather than being first daughter. So she grew into the changes in the culture where women did have more strength and influence. She didn't get to vote until she was 36. So to me, that's one of the most powerful statements that comes out of this book, to see how far we women have come and now are kind of being pushed out and backward. But we have great influence, and it's just that it gets erased and pushed back a little bit. But Alice was a great example. Alice was our great illustrator that women can have enormous power, especially in influencing each other.
Shelley Fraser Mickle is an award-winning author and one-time commentator for WUFT in North Central Florida with more than a dozen books under her belt. Her latest, a biography of Alice Roosevelt, is called White House Wild Child: How Alice Roosevelt Broke All the Rules and Won the Heart of America. It's out now through Imagine. Shelley, thanks for taking the time.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcasts.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter Airwaves at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night and down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete. sweet